That's one of the benefits of psychedelics. Yes, there's the experience where you see something, maybe you realize something, you get that insight, but it also, in the after period, gives you a period to work with where your brain is more susceptible to change and you have more facility with changing how you move forward in life. I think it's really helpful to have some sort of practice, whether that's journaling, whether that's yoga, whether that's meditation, whether that's conversation with people who are like-minded. Maybe it's all of those put together. But if you come in with the right expectations, it's a lot less likely that you will be disappointed.
Welcome, Tribe. I'm Maya Rose.
And I'm Gerald Rogers. We're about to embark on another mind-expanding episode where we dive deep into the realms of psychedelics, sex, and the superconscious.
This is a transformational experience of healing, manifestation, increased clarity, flow, and alignment.
So join us on this sacred journey as we receive the codes of transformation from scientists and psychonauts, shamans, tantra masters, mystics, and more.
Together, we'll unravel the secrets of plant medicine, sex magic, and other tools to tap into higher states of consciousness.
So why are we here? To answer the call, to share our passions, and to be advocates for alternative healing.
So get ready for a ride that transcends the ordinary and leads you to the extraordinary, because living a legendary life is not just a choice.
It's a sacred adventure.
Hello, Tribe. Welcome back to Psychedelics, Sex, and the Superconscious. I am so excited to introduce to you today Henry Winslow. Henry is actually the founder of Tricycle Day as a background in yoga, and Tricycle Day is actually a newsletter for those of you who haven't heard of it. It's quite popular, but it's a newsletter that is really focused on research, policy, and business regarding psychedelics, especially. So thought that would be a great fit for this show. And more than that, I got to know Henry at a heart level. We were involved in a mastermind in Denver and just fell in love with him instantly. He has this magnetic personality and this big smile, and he just was really, Henry, I was inspired by your vulnerability, your depth, your openness, your playfulness, which is what I really love about you too. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you today. And just as we dive in, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what Tricycle Day is and why you started it.
Okay, what an intro. Thank you for that, Maya Rose. It's nice to share this space with you. It was nice to share space with you in person, and so we'll settle for virtual for now. I think the play that you picked up on, the playfulness for me, is something that's become increasingly important in my life. People think of play as being something that's kind of an addendum after you take care of your business, and I disagree with that completely. I think the play should be integrated. All things really that are important to us should be integrated, right? That's the idea. So I say that kind of as a preface because playfulness is such an important part of Tricycle Day. So I'll answer your question. I started Tricycle Day newsletter in January 2023. So it's been a little over 2 years now since I launched the project. But it was really inspired by my first profound psychedelic experience, which was several years prior to that. I think most people who work in psychedelics, do anything professionally in this arena, began with a profound personal experience. So there's no surprise there. But I suppose what might be sort of surprising to people who are familiar with the newsletter is that, my beginnings with psychedelics were actually on the spiritual path, not the mental health path that is the predominant narrative today, particularly in the research and policy reform sides. So for me, you mentioned I had a background in yoga. I had been a really devoted yoga practitioner for about 10 years at that point. And I was a full-time yoga teacher, living sort of nomadically with my wife, going around teaching workshops. And at that point, when you're that deep in yoga, it's not just roll out your mat and do some stretching. There's esoteric philosophy. There's millennia of history, probably that, behind the yoga practice. So I was really in the weeds there, reading the literature, the esoteric spiritual texts. And one of the things that's celebrated in the yoga tradition is non-dual states. So one of the foundational texts of yoga is called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and it talks about 8 steps as like a process of yoga. And the final stage is described as samadhi. And samadhi is essentially the dissolution of the ego, right? The idea that the subject and the object, or the self and the other, become integrated into one. The veil of separation between the two falls away, and there's a spontaneous epiphany of oneness, of unity consciousness. And that was something that was very gripping to me from an intellectual point of view. I didn't really think I'd ever get a chance to experience it directly, despite, all my yoga practice, just because I was living in New York City, hustling to teach 15 classes a week or whatever. But then one of my yoga teacher friends said, "Hey, I got the shortcut. I just had this incredible experience with a psychedelic medicine, and I got to go straight to samadhi." And so that got my attention. Before that, I really didn't have any interest in psychedelics. But that convinced me. So, within a week, I'm walking in the door of my first ceremony, and it was with Bufo, so 5-MeO DMT. At that point, I didn't really know the hierarchy of, the different medicines. I didn't know that many consider that to be the crown jewel, the Mount Everest of psychedelics, if you will. But I went for it, and I had that experience. It was fundamentally transformative for me in an irreversible way, I would say.
Wow. Well, what an incredible story, and what a way to start your psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about, we can do a lot of work when it comes to accessing the super conscious, when it comes to reaching these non-dual states. And then there's these little moments of shortcuts, right? We're still the medicine, but having this vehicle that's the shortcut to get us where we are to where we want to be is amazing. And so that's really interesting that you had this experience. You were able to reach this state. How did you go from then having that experience and teaching yoga to be like, I want to help people understand about psychedelics? Like,
Yeah.
where did the journey come with Tricycle Day?
Yeah. So, right after that, for those who've had a 5-MeO DMT experience, that it can be quite destabilizing. I say that in a neutral way, like it just changes the way you look at the world around you and yourself. It's very identity challenging.
I haven't even had that experience yet. So I consider myself a psychonaut, but like you said, it's kind of like the crown jewel. I haven't been called yet. So I'm curious.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe I should describe the experience to you.
Yeah, I kind of want you to, because I'm like, I want to know what this was like.
Yeah, my experience of it was, it's you smoke it or vaporize it out of a pipe. So I was instructed to take the slowest, deepest breath that I could, and the facilitator held the pipe for me to my lips, bring my arms over my head, and then hold my breath. And I was like, "Okay, how long do you hold it?" And then, like, "When do you exhale?" I said, "Don't worry. You don't even have to think about that." Okay. And he told me the most important thing was to surrender to the experience. So I followed the instructions, and I took the deepest breath, and I held it. And true enough, before I could even exhale, I was in another dimension. I felt my being get pulled sort of from the center of my body down into the earth and through, like, into the center of the universe. And there was terror. There's definitely a panic in that first experience, because, I've never had a psychedelic experience before this, through a chemical, at least. And then that reminder flashed through my head, the most important thing to do is surrender. So I said, okay, maybe I'm dying. If I'm dying, let's find out what death is. There's nothing I can do about it at this point. I'm dead. And as soon as I accepted that, all of the panic and terror transmuted into love. And it was a love I had never felt before in my entire life. And that was kind of part of, back to the destabilizing thing, that might have been part of what was so challenging about it. It was, I never realized I had not experienced this kind of unconditional, pure love. And I remember the last thing that my mind could say, even before, like, the words fell away and that was no longer part of what Henry was, the words were, "Nothing else matters. You made it. This is the purpose of existing, is to feel this feeling of love in its purest form."
Wow. What an experience. I had a similar experience during an ayahuasca journey where it was like, what is there out there? And I took the ayahuasca, and I remember feeling this like total death of the ego, death of the soul. And I think it's valuable to mention in those experiences, it is the moment of acceptance or surrender into the experience rather than resistance of it. What I found was that the more I resisted, almost the more pain there was, the more
Oh yeah.
I struggled, then the more there was to really push against me. But once I surrendered into the experience, it was this, for me, in that experience, it was feeling like I was nothing, nowhere, no one. And then all of a sudden on the other side of that, I realized that because of that, I was everything, everywhere, and everyone. I was love. And I think that that's one of the most beautiful things that, of all the people that I've interviewed, that's the number one thing, that if you can surrender into these medicines and really survive that death of who you thought you were, that on the other side of that is always this unconditional love. So,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
it can be disorienting, right? When you come out of that and be like, I thought I knew what love was. I thought I knew who I
Who
was.
I was. Yeah.
I didn't. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
what was
totally. I
on the
think,
other side of
one thing that's interesting in the difference between, at least in my experience, between ayahuasca and 5-MeO or Bufo, is that you almost like don't even have a choice but
that?
to surrender, because it's so much sharper and like more violent in the way that it removes you from your ego, versus ayahuasca to me felt much more gentle. Like it guided me there and still gave me the choice, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Bufo is very fast.
Totally. Well, how did that experience change you? So you come out on the other side, you've
Yeah.
experienced unconditional love you've never experienced before. You've had the death of this this person you thought, this identity of who you thought you were.
Yeah. Well, there was some sadness, the first 2 or 3 days afterward, because there was sort of this realization, like, how have I gone nearly 30 years of my life thinking that this is all that there is?
Mm.
And like, have I wasted this time? And what do I do with this knowledge? It was disorienting, a little bit scary, and yeah, a little bit sad. I didn't have a lot of education at that point around the ideas of preparation and integration. It just wasn't part of the conversation for me, and I wasn't as immersed in the scene, to be exposed to those conversations. But fortunately, I already had those frameworks in place from my yoga practice. So first of all, going into it, I had an intellectual framework to understand what had just happened. Like, I had read about this for years, about a non-dual state. So it at least made sense in a way. And then moreover, in the integration afterward, I had a physical practice to come back to. I had community to come back to who could speak my language. I had students, that I could channel these spiritual insights into Dharma talks and share them, and they would be receptive to that. So I was lucky in the sense that my life was really set up to receive me and all these changes in a pretty healthy way. And that was almost, I mean, you could say it's happenstance, but also I never would have been interested in Bufo had it not been for the yoga. So it kind of worked out nicely.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like that community and conversations were really important to you in your integration journey.
Yeah. And also getting into my body physically.
Mm. Yeah.
Because after you have that experience where like my identity is, delocalized, decentralized from my body, like to operate in the physical world, you got to like embrace the meat suit. And so
Yeah.
my yoga practices helped me with that.
This is true. I actually, my favorite thing to do after an experience with psychedelics, like the next day, is either to do some yoga, like go outside, touch the ground. If it's nice outside, do some kind of yoga outside and feeling the sun and the skin and and the wind on my skin and the ground under me, or going and running for a little bit, feeling my heart rate elevate, feeling my body start to move and start to sweat. So
Yeah.
I
Your
100%
muscles
agree. It's
get
like you get
tired. Yeah.
blasted off into the universe, into these different dimensions, realms, the super conscious, and then to have that reminder to ground and come back into the
Yeah,
bodies.
because look, I mean, those experiences are beautiful, and the insight can completely change the way you operate in the world. But for me, like, I still care about 3D reality. Like, this is my life, and I almost said you only live once, but I don't know if that's true. Maybe we live multiple times. Who knows? But I still care about this life, and I care about showing up for it. So being grounded after these experiences is what matters to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's fast forward because I want to get into how did you go from this very first experience that yeah, you started off with the crown jewel of all psychedelics. You have this ego death, you find this unconditional love, you bring it back to your community in New York where you're teaching yoga.
Yeah.
How long ago was that?
That was the first time was beginning of 2019. So
Okay,
about
so
4 years before launching Tricycle Day.
okay, so take us to that moment. Like, how was Tricycle Day born?
Yeah. Basically after that experience, my eyes were open to psychedelics. I became interested in them. I was curious about the other plant medicines and other synthetic medicines for that matter. And I started reading about them. I started, connecting with other people who had experienced them. And around that time, a lot of other people were becoming interested in psychedelics too. That was not long after Michael Pollan's book came out, which was a real inflection point for mainstreamification of psychedelics. And also like the economic situation, it was a big time for investing. So like all these biopharma companies that were pursuing psychedelic medicines through the FDA route started coming online and raising a ton of money. So I was just watching that space, and even as just like an enthusiast, I was interested in seeing everything that was happening and tracking it. So I started consuming psychedelic media, but in my experience, it was pretty disjointed. Like I'd have to go to a lot of different places to find that information, and it was not particularly convenient, nor was it particularly, I was excited about it, but like the way the information was presented was not especially entertaining or fun. Um, so around, at the turn of the new year in 2023, Oregon had kind of just come online with their state regulated marketplace, which was very innovative. There was just a lot happening, and it felt like more and more was happening. So I said, if I want this, other people probably want it too, and I can do it in a different way. There's an unmet need here, so I'm going to fill it.
Yeah, I do have to say, I agree with you on a lot of the information, especially when I was first looking up, psychedelics and things. A lot of it was so research oriented,
Mhm.
so scientific. And for me, I'm a huge emotional processor. So I wanted to understand experiences. I wanted the science, I wanted the information, but I also wanted the juicy good stuff. I wanted the stuff that spoke to me. And one of the things that I love that you've done about Tricycle Day is that it really does, I think, speak to people in a way that connects with them at a personal level. Like, as I was looking up stuff, I'm like, I need to be a scientist to even understand what this
Yeah,
means. Like, I got my degree in language. I don't know what they're talking about. So,
yeah,
I love what you've done that with Tricycle Day and just really been able to connect the information to the audience so that
yeah.
people
Thank you.
understand what psychedelics are and they can understand how people are using them and how to use them safely. And as everything becomes legalized, like what does that look like? What does that mean? And I want to go to Tricycle Day too, because you've got a ton of subscribers. Obviously, there's a lot of people interested in this. Who have been some of the most interesting people, or who are some people that stand out as far as people that you've featured on Tricycle Day?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So for context to the listener, the newsletter has two types of issues. On Wednesday, I do a roundup of that week's news, in those three pillars: research, policy reform, and business. And then on Sunday, I send an interview piece. And, we're having a conversation right now. And this format is nice because you get to like hear people's voices and feel into their energy and emotion, kind of to your point. But I think one of the ways that I add value with Tricycle Day is there's so much competition for people's attention that
Mm.
brevity is a real value add. So I take these conversations that I have with people and then I edit them down into a written piece that takes 5 minutes to read. So it's very consolidated, edited, but the information is there. So to answer your question, there have been a lot of people that have really changed the way that I think about things and have been really insightful for me personally. And, that's always what I try to do is like follow my own curiosity. Uh, One of the things is just like, it's been cool to meet some people who I sort of put on a pedestal, like idols who are real pioneers in the psychedelic space. People like Robin Carhart Harris, for example, leading researcher, Rick Doblin from MAPS. So that's just kind of like a cool, like both exciting and humbling thing to get to experience. But maybe there's some recency bias here, but I just published an interview with someone named Erica Zelfand, who is a former primary care physician who now has more of a functional medicine practice. And I couldn't believe how excited people got in the response to this article. She talked a lot about drug-drug interactions. So, there've been a lot of people who are understandably, justifiably cautious about using psychedelics with, say, an SSRI or with a benzodiazepine. These are medications from, the pharmaceutical industry that a lot of people are on, and they're on them and they're seeking more help because they're still suffering. And yet, like the catch-22 is that many psychedelic facilitators don't want to touch that because they're not sure if it's safe or what kind of interactions might happen if they're contraindicated. And she has the knowledge from both sides of that world. And she kind of broke down a bunch of myths about things that can go wrong and said, actually, this is safe, whereas this is something nobody's talking about, and this can actually cause an interaction. And so, that was pretty cool because this information is not really widely available. And it felt like I was really kind of breaking it to my platform.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one yet, but I'm super excited to go and see that because I've heard such contradicting information on SSRIs and how they interact. And I think that's, it's funny because with psychedelics, I think a lot of psychedelics, when used properly, are way safer than pharmaceuticals when you mix those together. Like there's been so many, I think it's something like if you're on 5 or more, 6 or more medications, like you will have side effects that, really affect you. So obviously there's things that happen when we mix pharmaceutical drugs together. I think psychedelics in general are safer, but nobody really knows it because nobody's talking about it. And of course, like you said, everybody's cautious, but that's really good. So I'm going to have to go back and look at that one. I'm really
it's brand. It just came out this Sunday.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to go back and look at that. So I love that. Okay. Any others that stick out to you?
One that really set me down a path that I've explored a lot is an interview I did with a psychotherapist named Sunny Strasberg. That was pretty early on in Tricycle Days canon of material. But the reason why it was so impactful for me was that she introduced me to the framework of internal family systems. You're probably familiar with it, but for the listener, it's a type of parts work that allows you to kind of disambiguate different parts of your personality and find ways to reintegrate them. So the idea is you have these exiles who are often frozen in time from childhood trauma. Then you have other parts of you that are firefighters or protectors, and they kind of run the show if you don't actually facilitate the conversations between those different parts. And IFS is a very complementary technique alongside psychedelic work. I followed that rabbit hole and read the book from Dick Schwartz, who was her mentor, and have found a lot of healing personally from practicing it on myself.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. And I think that's so important for integration too. Internal family systems when it comes to integration of psychedelics. So powerful. If anybody's listening, not familiar, highly recommend looking at that. And of course, you can go to Tricycle Day. You
could start there with the Sunny article, but the book is called No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So this is so juicy. I have so many questions for you. So my next question is, Henry, you've been following the research, the policy, the business when it comes to psychedelics since 2023. So this has been going on for almost 2 years. 2 years now? Over 2 years?
Yeah, a little over.
Little over 2 years.
Yeah, we're 2025 now. Can you believe it?
I know, right? So what have you seen change is in regards to the research, the policy, the business? What has been the evolution? And also, what do you think the trajectory of all of this is?
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's been so much movement. I guess I can go, pillar by pillar. I mean, on the research side, one thing that I've noticed is that there's been some interest in developing analog molecules to naturally occurring psychedelics that are either more stable or safer for some reason, or the one that's most interesting and probably the most controversial of the tweaks that these biopharma companies are making is to strip away the subjective effects. So to take away the trip or the journey from the medicine and retain only the neuroplastic benefit. So the
What?
idea is that, you use the medicine and you don't have to have like hallucinations or go on a journey, but you still are able to put your brain in a state that is more malleable to change. And so you can imagine why that would be useful, if,
Yeah.
it's controversial because a lot of people see the subjective experience, the trip, as being therapeutic in and of itself, because you see these
Yeah.
memories maybe that have been suppressed, some ideas from your subconscious that come up, and it allows you to work with them directly. But it's interesting, and I'm curious to see how these kind of these research projects play out, because it certainly becomes much more accessible if you don't have to sit for 8 hours, if you can just have the change, and then there's still integration work probably to rewrite your thought patterns for a psychiatric condition like depression or anxiety. But then even it takes it outside of that realm entirely to neurodegenerative disease, things like Alzheimer's, things like Parkinson's, things like MS. So it could unlock therapeutic application of psychedelics for entirely other categories. I think that's pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah. No kidding. Yeah, my mind can't even comprehend how that would be, because like you said, my experience, so much of my healing has been like, wow, I realized something
Yeah.
that had been blocking me in my past through the actual, experience of the trip. I'm really curious about that. I
Yeah.
did
And
experience recently something a little bit different, but kind of to your point, where psilocin gummies. So that's where there's certain parts of the plant that are taken out, so the parts that kind of upset your stomach, and just the psilocin, which you still have a psychedelic experience with it, but it's much easier on the system. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And what's controversial about that, and I'm curious to know if you've come across anything about this, is then there's the battle between, like, there's the consciousness of the plant, right?
Mhm.
So lots of people say, well, that, like, a mushroom has a consciousness. It's a plant medicine. This is it has the wisdom of the earth in it. And then
Yeah.
you take that away and you create something like psilocin, or you create these molecules that are,
Mhm.
I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but you create the substance that
Yeah.
mimics the plant, but without the plant, it doesn't have the plant consciousness. So
Right.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Or what have you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
As I said before, I come at this from a spiritual background, not from, well, we never shared this, but actually my first job out of college was in working in healthcare advertising. So I do have the biopharma aspect too. But, what pulled me into the psychedelic world was the spiritual aspect. Um, so it's an interesting question for sure. I think we can pull it apart into different pieces of it, because like what you're talking about with a psilocin edible, that might still be naturally derived. Like you might extract the psilocin from mushrooms and then just put that compound into, the formulation. But then
Okay.
there's also the idea of like synthetics. So you could actually create the compound not from nature in a lab. And so maybe there's a spectrum there in terms of like how much of the spirit of the plant or fungus actually carries through. But even if we go to the extreme, right, to the synthetic version, I've had experiences with Bufo alvarius, so the organic toad-derived 5-MeO-DMT with all its secondary tryptamines and compounds, and I've smoked the synthetic 5-MeO-DMT.
Hmm.
And to me, the subjective experience, the journey, was identical.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's not to say that there's no spirit in the organic medicine, but I got what I needed from the synthetic. And to me, I'm making a choice because, I'm vegan. I prefer not to mess with animals and let them live their life the way that they are going to. And also, it's totally possible to treat these toads ethically, and people are doing that. But at the same time, let's not ignore the reality that as more and more attention and interest comes into this space and people want to smoke Bufo, they're going to be bad actors who come in and take advantage of these toads and potentially put them at risk of endangerment or extinction. And I would just rather make the choice to go synthetic as long as it's sustainable and easy and cheap, which it
Yeah.
is.
Well, you bring up some really good points there. And I mean, these are all just really interesting things. I think that's one of the reasons why I look forward to participating more in Tricycle Day is to at least have this in my awareness. So I have another curious question for you, and I want to get into the policy and business of psychedelics too, but
Yeah.
this is just, it's a curious question I have. I was talking with somebody recently, and there's been lots of different forums and meetings, and there have been native shaman invited that kind of go the traditional route when it comes to plant medicine. And then they're meeting with doctors that are creating, synthetic, and researchers. And where does that all fit in? Where do you think, with Tricycle Day, have you interviewed any indigenous shaman? What do you
Couple.
think about all that? How is that evolving? How has that evolved? What are your personal thoughts? And I'm just curious, because I keep hearing about this, and it's like this way of it. And on one hand, we're taking this ancient tradition that people have been doing for years, and it's been religious practices and very spiritual. And then we're using modern neuroscience and research, and we're trying to merge the two together. So how is that evolving?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. And it raises, questions of cultural appropriation loom. And there's also the question of, do these indigenous peoples who have cultivated these practices and medicines, do they even want, other people to experience them? And it kind of, it's a nice segue from the previous question, because that's actually one of the reasons why I think about like synthetics, like being in favor of synthetics in a way. One of the other medicines that there are questions around overharvesting and preservation of the plant is iboga, or ibogaine is the molecule itself.
Right.
And some chemists this year, pretty recently, in the past few months, for the first time, fully synthesized ibogaine without any, like there used to be partial synthesis, so you could get like part of the way, I guess, but they did it completely from source materials, which is pretty cool, because iboga only grows in like one part of, Central Africa, and it's critical and essential to the Bwiti people. So if more people are going to use this, and I would like more people to be able to use it, because it seems to be really helpful for traumatic brain injury, for PTSD, and all sorts of these things, then we want to do that without, compromising or extracting, or, basically just like putting the Bwiti people under all of the pressures of colonialism, right? So if we can create that on our own, great. And that feels like a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, well, it may be that there's something there when it comes to the indigenous practices versus the modern research and science. Maybe there is a reverence around the plants that can be there for people that want to go experience something with indigenous shaman in the jungle with plant medicine, versus maybe there's somebody that just wants to have the effect and they aren't wanting to travel to the jungle, and there's a synthetic version for them to experience or try. That doesn't have necessarily the same spiritual practices around it, but can have the same physical effect on the body. So
yeah, and you raise a good point, because I don't think that all of the spiritual effects can be reduced to the compound, right? A lot of it is the ceremony. It's the ritual that surrounds it. And you made the point earlier, like we are the medicine. I think that the ceremony is often the medicine, particularly with traditions like, the Bwiti's iboga rituals, and the Shipibo's rituals around ayahuasca. Like a lot of it is the song, and the invocation of spirits and the plant spirits, to your point earlier.
yeah, wow, I love this. I mean, and I think this is why I honor you so much in the work that you're doing and the inspiration that you had to start Tricycle Day. Real quick question that I want to get maybe a little more into the policy and business side of this, and I've seen it transform. Why Tricycle Day? Where
The
did
name?
Tricycle come from? Yeah.
Yeah, the name is really just, back to the brand being playful. And to me, playfulness is a form of accessibility, right? I want the information to be accessible. So I include little jokes and jabs. And Tricycle Day is a play on Bicycle Day, which is the name used to celebrate the first ever intentional dose of LSD, which was Albert Hofmann, Swiss chemist, who discovered it, how to synthesize it. And he didn't realize back in those times, you would just like take the drug that you were messing around with in the lab. So he took it himself, and then he rode home on his bicycle. And on his way home, you know what happens from there. The walls of reality start melting down. So people celebrate April 19th as sort of a psychedelic culture holiday, Bicycle Day. And I said, okay, for people who know that, it's a little Easter egg. It's a if you know kind of thing. And it's tricycle instead of bicycle because it's accessible. It's easier to ride a three-wheeled vehicle than two.
Yeah, I bet he wished he'd been on a tricycle when that
Would have been a
LSD
little
started.
bit. Yeah, more manageable.
Like, I don't know how he didn't fall off his bike. I've heard that story before, and I was like, I've been to Burning Man,
Mhm.
and we have experiences out in the playa, and there's sometimes I'm like, wow, Gerald actually has we have these electric bikes, and he has this little cart that he hooks up to the back,
Mhm.
and we call it the Queen's cart. So
Because you ride in it?
yeah, on the night that we have our experience, I'll ride in the back there. I'm like, I want to be riding a bike. She's
Yeah.
like, you can ride the bike. And so I put my little, crown on. It's all lit up, and he wraps me up in blankets, and he pulls me around on the fly, and we go to different places. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's trust.
Yeah.
That's surrender right there.
Yeah, that's true. I do. I wouldn't do that with anybody else. With Gerald, yes. So it's actually funny, just like total side note. This has nothing to do with Tricycle Day, but this is an interesting story that I love to share. When Gerald and I were first dating, the moment that I knew that we were like kind of meant to be together and that his energy could hold my energy, we were on Venice Beach and we were on a date. And it's back when they used to allow the bird scooters on the boardwalk.
Mhm.
And ironically enough, we found ourselves at a Burning Man reunion party. Neither of us had ever been to Burning Man. Now we run a Burning Man camp. This is our 5th year running a camp. But we thought it was fun. And then Gerald rented a scooter. And there was this moment we're on the boardwalk and he's on the scooter. And I remember he extended his hand down to me and he's like, "Hey, do you trust me?" And
It's like
honestly,
Aladdin. Aladdin
yeah,
to Jasmine.
exactly. Just like Aladdin. It was a magic scooter, not a magic carpet. And, I have a history of more anxiety and OCD, and I tend to be more cautious in those situations. I'm this guy that I barely know is asking me to ride on this scooter on this boardwalk. It was at night, Venice Beach, but I don't know why. I just found myself saying yes, and I grabbed onto his hand. I stepped on the scooter, and like the moment my back hit his chest, my whole body just went, and it's like I felt this trust from the divine masculine for the first time. It was incredible. So there's my little side note. Not even sure how we got on that tangent, but
Love
fun
it.
moment.
Yeah. That was your
Funny
Princess
ones.
Jasmine moment.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about research. There's like policy and business. I want to know
Mhm.
because I feel like in the psychedelic industry, I feel like there's so many different businesses popping up,
Yeah.
so many different policy. Like, share with me a little bit about your thoughts on this and what you see happening and where you see things
Mhm.
going. On one hand, there's this idea that if, when all psychedelics become legalized, then there's going to be so many restrictions on them. And then
Mhm.
there's other thoughts if this is good. So I just want to hear your thoughts on all of this, what you've seen the
Yeah.
past 2 years.
Yeah. So there are really like 3 different pathways that are being pursued simultaneously to make psychedelics more legally accessible. One is decriminalization, which is just a policy effort, right? It's like stop criminalizing the possession, use, sharing of these substances, particularly the ones that occur naturally. Like that seems like an easier sell than including all the synthetics too, like MDMA and LSD. But some of the efforts actually include those as well. So there's decriminalization. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there is the medicalization. So taking a specific drug, moving it through a clinical trial program, and submitting it to the FDA for approval under the specific conditions of a specific therapeutic application. So if you have a diagnosis with X, Y, Z condition, a doctor can prescribe it to you. Then somewhere in the middle is these emerging state-regulated markets. It began with Oregon. Oregon Psilocybin Services was the first state to come online and have a facilitated use model that did not hinge on a medical diagnosis. And actually the service providers there are generally not clinicians. They might be clinicians, but they actually, if they are, they have to keep those businesses entirely separate under the rule of the law. Colorado is the second state to come online with a similar program. They learned a lot from Oregon and kind of evolved it. And it's, they first passed with the personal use provision. So people have been able to legally consume psychedelics there for some time now, but they're just now handing out their first licenses for so-called healing centers. And facilitators there can, again, like Oregon, facilitate an experience. And with them, it's a little bit different because you can actually also be a clinician and merge those practices. And they also opened up a few other kind of more flexibility, basically.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of other states watching these models and seeing if they're going to work. And that's kind of what makes it feel so heavy stakes, to me, is if they don't work, then the other states will be like, okay, that was a failed experiment, so we're not going to do it. And then it goes back under the rug. Of course, there are other, policy reform styles. There's some pretty interesting things being submitted around various states. One that I always point to is New York. There's a bill that would create a program where you go through an education program and you apply to have a permit, a psilocybin use permit. And it doesn't require a facilitator, but it just requires that you've proven that you know what you're doing. And then you're allowed to purchase from a cultivator and have your own experiences. So a lot of different interesting things going on. And of course, the businesses are incredibly tied, to what the regulations allow.
Well, also, I mean, there's the religious aspect of it too. I know
Yep,
I
the
like
churches.
you're in Utah most of the time, and there's the churches. So there's a lot that's protected under this label of a church too. So yeah, I still feel like it's a little bit in a state of chaos right now. Like I feel like the world is waking up to the fact that the use of psychedelics has a massive impact on not only the healing of humanity, such as like with the PTSD, depression, anxiety, everything like that, but also the expansion, the access to the super
for healthy people.
Like for us to be able to access this super conscious state, which, by the way, I'd love for you to share what super conscious means to you in just a moment, but for us to be able to access the super conscious state. So I feel like there's this general knowledge now, more and more and more, that everybody's in agreement that psychedelics have in the proper usage, in the proper settings, have the ability to massively impact humanity as a whole, but also like individuals. And I feel like it's just like a shit show right now with everybody trying to figure out, like, how do we actually do that? How do we create that? How is this going to be legalized? And I'm really thankful for the work that's being done to do that. But I feel like it's just such an interesting time right now where there's so much knowledge.
There's a lot in flux. Yeah, and I would challenge the statement you made that everybody agrees that these are, beneficial things that will catalyze positive change in society. And I think that's why, there is still a lot of chaos and uncertainty. Is in our bubble, in our social circles, everyone agrees, but a lot of people don't see it that way, either because of a lack of information or they feel informed and still feel that way. So yeah, there is a lot. We're kind of at this, there's a lot hanging in the balance right now. I agree.
I don't know if you want to answer this personally or if you want to base this on research, but where do you think this is all going in the next couple of years?
I don't know. I have hopes, My hope is that decriminalization becomes kind of like the baseline and everybody agrees on that. And from there, I think that the other models can coexist. If we have decriminalization, then people will be able to use these substances, these medicines on their own, self-directed, right? I think the facilitated use model is great for people who want to feel like they have a trusted support around them. And I think the FDA model is actually great as well for people who have very, sensitive conditions and are, basically being failed by the current pharmaceuticals and healthcare system. So I think they all exist for different people, and set and setting matter, and what people want from an experience matters, because you can go the spiritual route and join a church. Maybe you just really depressed, and suicidally. And luckily, we haven't talked about this at all, but ketamine is approved. People are getting treatment through ketamine, which is not a classic psychedelic, but it shares some of the qualities, and politically it's definitely been grouped in that category. So it's cool to see that that's available and it's becoming more and more embraced too. Where it's going, I don't know, but I'll definitely be watching, that's for sure, and
Yeah.
reporting on it.
Well, you'll be watching, reporting, bringing the news to all of us. Before we get into your definition of the superconscious, one other thing that's present for me right now is just in the interviews you've done, in the research that you've looked at, and the information you brought, what do you think is the most important thing, or some of the most important things for people who are doing psychedelics or considering the use of psychedelics? What do you think makes or breaks the experience? Is there anything that you would recommend, anything that you would say, hey, in my research and my experience, this is something really important to focus on or look at? What would that be?
It's topical because we came up earlier. I would say, first of all, yeah, make sure that you are in a place neurochemically, in terms of your other medications, that it's safe to proceed. And if you have a doctor who is open to these conversations, it's good to talk to them if you're unsure. Then with that out of the way, I think the next most important thing is like, come in with an intention. This is part of set and setting. Because if you have an intention, it's going to guide you to make choices that are adaptive and supportive for you with your set and setting. Choose the medicine that will best support the goal that you're looking for. And most importantly is understand that the psychedelic experience itself will not fundamentally change you. What it will do is give you insight. And ideally, hopefully it will give you insight. But it's up to you to make a choice what to do with that, right? So sometimes the way that that's expressed is like, psychedelics will open a door for you, but you still need to walk through it. And walking through it takes work often. The more entrenched your beliefs, thoughts, action patterns are that you're trying to rewrite, the more work it takes. And, back to that neuroplasticity conversation, that's one of the benefits of psychedelics. Yes, there's the experience where you see something, maybe you realize something, you get that insight. But it also, in the after period, gives you, a period to work with where your brain is more susceptible to change, and you have more facility with changing how you move forward in life. But it takes work, it takes practice. I think it's really helpful to have some sort of practice, whether that's journaling, whether that's yoga, whether that's meditation, whether that's conversation with people who are like-minded. Maybe it's all of those put together. But if you come in with the right expectations, it's a lot less likely that you will be disappointed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to second all of that. Intention, so important. Integration, so important. Like intention and integration, I think are more important than the ceremony itself. Like the experience itself holds no real weight in changing if you don't have those two things. And then I love what you said about really being aware that it's you doing the work. Like this is going to give you the insight. And how I like to think about it is we have, this old way of doing things, a neural pathway that's so solid in our mind. And if we want to change something, this belief pattern, this neural pathway, when we experience psychedelics, when done in the right way, it opens up a new neural pathway, or an opportunity for a new neural pathway through the neuroplasticity. But when you get done with the experience, you still have the old neural pathway and the new one. So now they're both equally as strong. And it's what you do afterwards. Are you going to go back to the old patterns, the old habits, the old neural pathway, in which case you've just had an experience that doesn't really change anything. And this also is where I think sometimes people get into this cycle of healing where they feel like I need to have an experience, then I have an awakening, and then I go back to my old patterns. Now I need to have another experience, and now I have another awakening and go back to the old patterns. But it's really what we do afterwards. Like if you're willing to do the work to strengthen this new neural pathway, this new belief system, this new way of being, if you're willing to do those things, then that's the new pattern that's going to stick in your life.
Yeah. And the reason why it takes work is because when you have those two pathways to choose from, typically, if there's a long history in your life of the original one, the gravity is going to be pulling you there. So you have to actively resist it, which means making choices that feel uncomfortable. It means doing things you normally wouldn't do. to fall into that other path. And then the more you get into that path, the more that groove gets entrenched. And then, then you have inertia on your side to stay on that one. The one thing I would just add on to what your point around the cycle of healing is that, I don't say this to judge anyone, but yeah, sometimes you see people and they're just rehashing the same thing over and over again. That is different from ascending, right? You can heal something and then you get to the next level and new problems emerge. And maybe, things come up that you never were ready to address before. And now you take that on and you go to the next level. So that's different than just being on the treadmill.
Yeah, and thank you for that distinction, because it is like a spiral of healing. But you're absolutely right. I've seen people, and even in the past, I've been stuck in this thing where it's like every single experience is revisiting the same thing, the same pain point, and it's almost like this addiction versus, wow, I experienced that. Here's steps. I'm going to do something about it. And now it opens up a new layer, level of healing.
Yeah.
And there's something new. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I don't think
Sure.
any of us, well, maybe there are some ascended masters actually that have walked this earth that maybe have completed their cycle of healing, but I'm far from that. I don't know.
Yeah, it takes a really special person to do that, because
yeah.
I mean, just the anomaly of making it there, but then also you have to make the choice once you're ascended to say, I'm staying here to help the others.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not anywhere close to that.
Instead of just releasing from the samsara altogether.
A great goal to have. Okay. So the other thing, I just really want to hear your definition of the superconscious. I think a lot of psychedelic uses can be to heal traumas, can be to create new belief systems that are going to serve us better. But then there's this other aspect of it, and that's expansion, peak performance, accessing this universal oneness, this network, this super conscious. Maybe that was even part of the non-duality that you spoke of. So what is your definition of the super conscious, and have you been able to access that through your different experiences?
Yeah. I think of the super conscious. I was introduced to that concept in my yoga days. I never used that term. The term that was used by one of my teachers, Sri Dharma Mitra, was the collective consciousness. And he talked about the mind being an antenna. And so if we tune our antenna through our practices, through our psychic development practices, through our yoga practices, through our meditation, then the antenna is more able to receive insight, wisdom, intelligence from the one cloud of everything. So, that conceptualization of the mind as an antenna versus as something that is self-referential or, ideas coming from within completely changes the way that you think about, creativity, the way that you think about productivity, peak performance, all these things that you mentioned, because it shows that you are but a vehicle, a conduit, if you will, for ideas. They come through you if your antenna is tuned, and then you express them, but they're not yours to begin with, right? You're just, an appendage of the universal consciousness. So that's how I think about superconscious, is like me being a vehicle, an instrument of the great one, all that is.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, what are the ways that you access the superconscious? Psychedelics is obviously one of them. What are some other ways or practices that you have to reach that collective consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious ones are outside of psychedelics, would be my yoga practice and meditation practice. But I also find that, another thing that people talk about often that I think is related, if not, just a synonym for this, is flow state. So when I'm connected to something that I'm doing, whether it's writing or, walking or being in total presence with my son, like those are moments where I've stepped out of my own way and everything is like just kind of happening. I'm almost like not in control of it. So that's another example. And those they're harder to like force to happen, right? They kind of happen spontaneously when the conditions are right, but you can work on the conditions.
Yeah, I would agree with that a lot. One of the things that's been coming to me recently, I don't know. I guess you could loosely call it, some people would label it channeling. I don't really like to use that term, but when I'm working with a client and I'm in a fully focused state and I can tell they're in a state of devotion and they're asking me a sincere question, it's like sometimes I'm able to access information where I feel like it's flowing through me and I find myself saying things. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I need to write that down. Like it's not coming from my conscious brain. It's just kind of coming through
Yeah.
me. Or I agree, these moments, I don't know, maybe it's moments of pure joy and play. I'm going to add play into the mix of super conscious. I know that's big for
Yeah.
you too, but I had this experience with my grandson just a couple of days ago. I was staying the night at his house and he woke up early and one of my daughters sleep in. We went outside with these sidewalk chalks and we just started like drawing and playing and we had these bubbles and we were running and I found such pure joy flowing through my body that it wasn't anything that was being spoken by my words, but it was an expansion of my soul. And
Hmm.
suddenly I was more aware of every tree, every flower, every blade of grass. I was more aware of the other people in the park and their essence of joy. So I think
Hmm.
there's lots of different ways to access the super conscious. And I want to share one story. This story is remarkable. I think you'll appreciate it. You know, another way that I experience accessing the superconscious, like heightened states of pleasure. And there was one beautiful lovemaking ceremony that Gerald and I had one day. And afterwards, I was just in this state of euphoria. I mean, it's the same as when you're in this play state with your child or your grandchild, or you know what I'm talking about.
First, I
But
just have to interrupt you and tell you that I think it's amazing that you call it a ceremony.
oh,
That's epic. I'm going to borrow
yeah.
that.
I loved it. So I was in this euphoric state, you know, and all of a sudden it's this experience that I have kind of like you described with the 5-MeO, which is where I feel like I'm nothing, nowhere, no one. And then all of a sudden something comes to me. And I remember I sat up and I started seeing this series of numbers and Gerald's like, are you okay? Like I'm obsessively saying this series of numbers. And I was like, this has something to do with something. And this was during COVID. And I looked up what the numbers were. And I think the second thing that came to my mind was a gene code. And suddenly I just knew, I'm like, there's something to do with this gene code that has to do with basically solving what we're experiencing with this pandemic. And I'm not a geneticist, so I don't even know any geneticists. I reached out to a few people. Nothing ever really came of it. And honestly, I was a little bit like, that was weird and almost a little salty. Like, what? Why did that happen? You know? And like a year later, I'm sitting in a consciousness conference in San Diego. Bruce Lipton's talking, Greg Braden, Nassim Harriman was there, just epic lineup. And I'll never forget the moment I'm sitting between Gerald and our friend, and Bruce Lipton's up there talking. I'm pretty sure he's referring to COVID, but can't say it. But he's talking about how our thoughts, you know, he's the father of epigenetics, our thoughts create a frequency that impacts our cells and shifts our cells, and then this frequency's set out into our field. And as he's going through this, he's describing the process from a scientific standpoint. And he described that there's a protein cell that allows the thought into the cell, right? That actually changes the frequency of the cell, and that was that protein code was the gene code that I had received in my download. Suddenly, in that moment, I knew I'd gotten that. It was because, you know, our whole work is around your thoughts matter, accessing the super conscious, creating a new state of reality through your consciousness can actually transform your body and can create new states of consciousness within the cell. And then it affects impacts your reality. And I thought, yeah, that is how we overcome mass hypnosis. And this is how we do deal with any kind of problem that enters into our field, is by, you know, maintaining our sovereignty to, you know, have a thought form, to know that we can access the superconscious, to know that we can shift and change our reality. So it's really beautiful.
Awesome. Yeah. The days of being able to deny the connection between mind and body with a straight face are long gone. I mean, this even all the scientists know that that's true now.
Absolutely. Well, Henry, it's been such a pleasure to have you here. And for everybody in our tribe who's listening, who might not already be familiar with Tricycle Day, could you share how they can access this newsletters? I highly, highly recommend, if you're interested on staying connected to the top of psychedelics, which you probably are if you're listening to the show. So, Henry, how can they access that?
Yeah, of course. Easy. Just go to tricycleday.com. There's a field there where you can enter your email, and you'll start getting twice a week emails from me. And aside from the newsletter itself, if you are a facilitator of psychedelic medicine or a coach around integration and preparation, we also have a community, a membership community that might be of interest to you. It's really about creating a safe space for those conversations to happen, and specifically learning the skills of marketing and sales to develop one's practice to make it a sustainable source of income. So that's there. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll learn about it.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know we're going to interview you on our Alliance meeting soon. I want you to tell everybody about that component of it too, because
I will.
What an amazing aspect. So, well, thank you so much, Henry. What is your final message you want to leave with everybody today?
Oh, wow. I get a final message. Okay.
Yep.
I'll leave everyone with the final message that I took away from that first Bufo ceremony, which was, I may have dangers posed to my physical body. I may have psychological dangers posed to my mind. I may have emotional dangers posed to my feelings, but nothing can change the fact that my spirit is safe. And I wish that everyone who's listening to this has an experience that shows them that that's true for them too.
Well said. Amen. Aho, so it is. Thank you, Tribe, for listening. And thank you again for being here, Henry. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Maya Rose.
Thank you, legendary explorers, for joining us on this cosmic journey today.
Your curiosity fuels our exploration of psychedelics, sex, and the superconscious.
If you're hungry for more, dive into our website and connect with us on social media. All the links are in the show notes.
And stay tuned for our next mind-expanding episode. We can't wait to talk to you again in our next adventure.
Until then, remember, this is your life. So,
make it legendary.